With Osama bin Laden hunted down and killed by US special forces, who's best placed to take over as the new leader of al-Qaeda? With the death of its iconic leader, how will al-Qaeda operate in the future? And how will Western countries adapt to the changing face of the group? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Darren Jordon. Osama bin Laden became the face of militant Islam following the September the 11th attacks in New York. And it was these attacks that propelled his organisation to the world's attention. So without bin Laden, what happens to al-Qaeda now? Well, let's begin with taking a look at some potential replacements. His most obvious successor is Ayman al-Zawahiri. Born in Cairo, he was a key figure in the Egyptian Islamist movement. He fought against the Soviets in Afghanistan and was bin Laden's closest advisor. Another potential replacement is Anwar al-Awlaki. Born in New Mexico, he's now become the spokesman for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Seen more as a cleric than a fighter, Awlaki is believed to have played a key role in a number of terrorist plots in the US. And then there's Abu Yahya al-Libi, a leading al-Qaeda ideologue. He was a commander in Afghanistan. Al-Libi has been active in urging resistance and recruits from Europe and North America. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by our three guests. From Islamabad, Imtiaz Gul, political analyst and author of several books on al-Qaeda, including The Most Dangerous Place. From Leeds, Paul Rogers, a professor of peace studies at the University of Bradford. Professor Rogers focuses on Western military responses to political violence and the war on terror. From London, Mahan Abedin, Director of Research at the Centre for the Study of Terrorism. Mr. Abedin also co-edited Unmasking Terror, a global review of terrorist activities. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Paul Rogers in Leeds, let me start with you, if I may. There's obviously much speculation now on who might take over the reins of al-Qaeda. Who do you think is likely to take bin Laden's place and why?
I don't think anybody will actually be able to take bin Laden's place. He wasn't a major figure in the leadership in recent years. He was much more of an iconic figure for the outside world, and particularly so for the United States, because there was this kind of bitterness which pervaded American society that they'd not succeeded in capturing or killing him. There isn't anybody directly who can take on that kind of mantle. It may well be that the al-Qaeda leadership, insofar as it exists, will not put any one person forward. As you said, in some ways Zawahiri is maybe the most likely one, but I'm not even sure there. In any case, the movement itself has morphed incredibly in the last 8 to 10 years. It's much more of a dispersed entity, almost at the level of an idea rather than a movement in the true sense of the word. So I think we're into uncertain times for al-Qaeda, and in one way we may find that there isn't any single leader coming to the fore. Instead, to some extent, bin Laden will make the transition from an iconic live leader to some sort of martyr figure, and that may be the major effort.
Mahan Abedin in London, I mean, what's your assessment of any new leader in these uncertain times for al-Qaeda? What about Abu Yahya al-Libi? I mean, he's a leading ideologue, he's operated in Afghanistan. What do you make of him?
Well, there are several contenders, and you've just alluded to one of them. Anwar al-Awlaki is another one. Then there's the head of the al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Abu al-Wudud. And there's also Sulaiman Abu Qais, a Kuwaiti-born ideologue, and of course Ayman al-Zawahiri, the nominal number 2. These are all main contenders, but I'd also like to echo the thought that al-Qaeda really hasn't existed as a proper organization in any sense of the term for many, many years. It's more of a network and so certainly there's being the leader of that organization doesn't come with a job description, and it'll be extremely hard to replace bin Laden because he was an iconic figure. He had become an inspiration for jihadis of all types and stripes for a great number of years, and it'll be very, very difficult to replace the inspirational role that he was playing. And in fact, al-Qaeda, insofar as it exists, it may decide not to come up with a direct replacement. I mean, they will clearly go through a process of internal debate and dialogue in the coming weeks and months. They may declare a nominal replacement, but then they may not, and they may carry on as they have done. I mean, what remains of al-Qaeda Central insofar as Al-Qaeda Central actually exists, is essentially no more than 120 to 160 key operatives in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. That's not a great number of people. The Americans have been striking a very triumphalist note in the past couple of days. There's now talk of the Americans pressing home their advantage and destroying Al-Qaeda. That remains to be seen.
Okay.
Because don't forget that there are broader networks that buy into that narrative. And then you're talking of proper organizations. Okay. For instance, Jamiat al-Dawa and Lashkar-e-Tayyiba in Pakistan, for instance, been very vocal in the past 48 hours in mourning Osama bin Laden's demise.
Okay.
So yeah.
Let's just bring in Imtiaz Gul in Islamabad there. Imtiaz, Ayman al-Zawahiri seems to be bin Laden's obvious successor, but all the experts say he lacks the charisma and, of course, the iconic status of Osama bin Laden. Is he likely to take over, do you think? What's your assessment there in Pakistan?
Well, I think most of the people in Pakistan are familiar mostly with Ayman al-Zawahiri as the person who had been commanding all the operations from wherever he is. So I think that right now the biggest question confronting the people here is whether the death of Osama bin Laden weakens this organization. They are focused more on this rather than who will take on the mantle of Osama bin Laden, because he had disappeared from the scene anyway. However, one has to remember that most probably Ayman al-Zawahiri would continue to serve as the unifying force for many factions that currently are operating across the world in Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as in the Arabian Peninsula. So I think Zawahiri remains the single largest, most popular personality, most probably, who will continue the way he has continued so far.
Paul Rogers in Leeds, how much of a blow is the death of Osama bin Laden to Al-Qaeda?
Well, I think the first thing to recognise is that the Al-Qaeda leadership, pretty dispersed as it is, and not just in Pakistan, as was said, will have been expecting this at some stage. At any time in the last 8 to 10 years, they would have expected at some stage that bin Laden would have either been killed or captured. And so there will be some sort of rubric, some sort of plan available for how they will handle it. The exact manner of his being killed or captured wouldn't have been known. The way it happened has obviously been a surprise for many reasons in relation to the location in Pakistan. But from their perspective, it's not a huge issue. The movement has many more problems. It is very dispersed, as was just said. It links in with a whole range of other groups in a very amorphous way. And if anything, to some extent, the strength probably lies more in the Arabian Peninsula, particularly in Yemen at present. I think the other point, which is very well worth making, is that bin Laden is seen as this huge iconic figure, especially in the United States. The jubilation that you saw there relates very much to their own memory of the 9/11 atrocities and the way that, in spite of all the wars, all the activity, they failed to track bin Laden down. And this is why you get this kind of almost triumphalist mood. You're not getting the same kind of mood in Western Europe. You're certainly not getting in Britain. So I think this is very much an American phenomenon. And because of that, there's a certain sense to actually maybe overestimate the significance of bin Laden's passing. It may well be that how the Arab Spring develops and how Al-Qaeda tries desperately to react to that may be seen as a much more important event of early May in a few years' time.
OK, we'll talk about the Arab Spring in just a while. Let's bring in back Mahan Abedin in London. Mahan, so what's your estimation or your assessment of what happens to the Al-Qaeda brand now? I mean, do you think we'll go through some sort of organisational changes, smaller groups perhaps, more regionalised? What do you think?
Al-Qaeda is facing several crises. Its biggest crisis is an ideological one. I mean, this is a movement that knows very well how to cope with security and military setbacks. What it can't cope very well with is ideological challenges, especially from within the jihadi community. And in recent years, a number of leading ideologues who are either within al-Qaeda or certainly connected to it in an ideological sense, have broken away, and they've critiqued this jihadi narrative of discriminate, indeed even mindless violence, and to have these jihadi ideologues come along and to deconstruct that narrative from both an ideological and especially theological perspective, that really is very bad news for them. And this is happening at many levels. It's happening at the level of the online forums, which are still very important. It's happening at a kind of a scholarly level with these scholarly products that some of these jihadi ideologues produce. And this is a very big challenge for al-Qaeda. There are other challenges. I mean, the fact that the organization really does not exist in any recognizable forms. Then there's the challenge of a leadership deficit. I mean, all the individuals we've been discussing so far, with the possible exception of Ayman al-Zawahiri, because Zawahiri, apart from being an able day-to-day administrator, is also a very able strategic thinker and planner. In fact, he was probably the real ideological mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, as a massive event that would propel a special segment within the Islamist community, i.e. the jihadis, into a direct clash with the United States, which in turn would suck in broader network of Islamists, and then following on from that, the broader kind of layers of Muslims, and would eventually, in due course, engineer a clash of civilizations.
Okay, let's just move the argument on.
That didn't happen.
Okay, let's just move the argument on if we can. Gentlemen, stay with us, because al-Qaeda's reach has spread far and wide. Let's take a quick look at its main affiliates. We've been talking about some of them. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM, gained prominence in January 2007. Previously known as Algeria's Group for Preaching and Combat, AQIM wants to turn Algeria into an Islamic state. Then there is al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI. Founded in 2004 by the late Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, its goals were to force the withdrawal of US forces from Iraq, topple the interim government, and again form an Islamic state. And finally, there's al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In 2009, Yemeni and Saudi wings of the organization merged, but their base remains in Yemen. Imtiaz Gul, there are a number of al-Qaeda-linked groups in Pakistan that the government has cracked down on, but many of these militants have fled to the mountainous regions along the Afghan border. Is the Pakistani government winning that fight?
Well, I don't think that you can put it really that way. As we've been discussing this earlier, that al-Qaeda right now is not an organization that is based on a nationalist or separatist ideology or thought. This is a religious, spiritual movement right now, an amorphous movement that draws its strength from a particular ideology. The ideology that Osama bin Laden and Imam al-Zawahiri had been propagating, and that is to bring about a revolution in the Middle East, that is to purge the world of the American influences and end the American dominance. And the same, I think, is true for a number of al-Qaeda force multipliers operating inside Pakistan, whether it's Lashkar-e-Taiba, whether it is Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or Lashkar-e-Islam. So there are many local force multipliers, or al-Qaeda auxiliaries, who are spread out across the country, in this country of 180 million people. Now, to say that a country or a nation can win against an ideology is, I think, a very, very big claim to make. It's not going to happen that way, regardless of whether even Imam al-Zawahiri is taken out anytime. This thought, this ideology is likely to continue, keep posing a problem, a challenge for the United States, as well as for Pakistan and other countries who have been part of this counter-terror campaign since 2001.
Paul Rogers, I want to just bring you back into the argument. There was a point you raised earlier on about the Arab Spring, because a key part of al-Qaeda ideology is, of course, that they want an Islamic revolution. Now, there are revolutions sweeping the Arab world, but they're for democracy. So what's gone wrong with the al-Qaeda ideology? Why has it lost its appeal?
I think it's really lost its appeal because it just has not struck a chord sufficiently right across the region. There are many individual elements in countries, including in diaspora communities in Western Europe and North America. But at root, as was just said very precisely, this is in a sense a kind of religious ideological movement coming from one particular perspective. And what has happened is that while it's long had the aim of dealing with the far enemy of the United States and the near enemy, the unacceptable regimes across the Arab Islamic world, what it has not been able to do is actually to rouse a kind of revolutionary fervour. Instead, and this is potentially disastrous, what has happened has been mass protests, first in Tunisia and then in Egypt, which have actually overthrown autocratic regimes. But these have been protests by huge numbers of people without this religious ideological bent, in fact, to some extent, even secular. And this is exactly the wrong kind of revolution that al-Qaeda is looking for. In a real sense, it's been sidelined. Now, the positive element of that is that if the Arab Spring does actually transform itself into something which is genuinely more emancipatory, with greater equity and greater democracy, then that will be huge problems for the al-Qaeda organization or movement or idea, more so in many ways than the death of bin Laden. If, however, the Arab Spring does not deliver, there is a return to more repressive regimes. Under those circumstances and those alone, al-Qaeda might be able to remodel itself and present itself as the only truly radical alternative to what has befallen the Middle East.
So let me
and
put
that,
this...
I think, is going to really pan out over the next year or so.
So let me put that point to Mahan Abedin. Mahan, I mean, has the Arab Spring underlined this huge divide between al-Qaeda's ideology and this kind of universal acceptance in the Arab world that people want democracy, they want social reform, because that's not part of the al-Qaeda narrative, is it?
Well, al-Qaeda and the wider Islamic militant jihadi community have never been able to produce anything approaching a coherent political program, let alone a political philosophy. And that's one of the reasons they were never really able to establish a proper political base in any of these countries. Now, I actually think this is a slightly contrived debate trying to bring al-Qaeda into the Arab Spring model. But nevertheless, at the political level, al-Qaeda's chief competitors have always been other type of Islamists, namely peaceful, more thoughtful, organized political Islamists in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, in Egypt and other parts of the Arab world, al-Nahda, for instance, in Tunisia, and the various Islamic groupings in Algeria, namely the former Islamic Salvation Front, the FIS, which contested elections and won the elections, but was then prevented from taking power by the Algerian military in January 1992. So its chief opponents and enemies in the political sphere were in fact other Islamists. And if you look at some of the scholarly works of Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, his invective is directed not necessarily towards secularists, it's actually directed towards the Muslim Brotherhood movement. I mean, he wrote The Bitter Harvest, for instance, critiquing the Muslim Brothers' decades-long quest, a failed quest to win political power in Egypt. And I think the killing of bin Laden and eventually the eventual demise of al-Qaeda, not as an organization, because as we've discussed today, it really doesn't exist in an organizational sense, but the eventual demise of this kind of jihadi thinking will strengthen and empower other type of Islamists. And that's very important in the light of what's been taking place in these half-hearted revolutions or halfway revolutions in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, where new political systems are gradually emerging. And that's where more thoughtful Islamists will be able to actually contest elections and will be able to negotiate more political space for political Islam in the public sphere. And I think that's going to be the key political development.
Let me put that point to Imtiaz Gul then. Imtiaz, you were nodding there. I mean, do you see the changing face of al-Qaeda morphing into people, more thoughtful Islamists, those sorts of people taking on the power base rather than the sort of al-Qaeda we're seeing today?
Yeah, it's quite possible. If you look at Pakistan, some of the religio-political parties that had been sympathetic and supportive of the cause of Osama bin Laden have been part of the mainstream Pakistani politics, like Jamaat Islami and Jamiat Ulama Islam. Both have been, and a number of al-Qaeda people, al-Qaeda operatives have been arrested from residences or seminaries being run by the members of these two parties. And essentially these parties believe in pluralistic democracy. And I guess somehow the invasion of Afghanistan, the unfolding of the war against terrorism in Afghanistan basically provided these people with an excuse to align themselves with al-Qaeda, which radiates a different message, which believes in militant Islam, whereas in Pakistan these parties have been very much part of mainstream politics. So I would suppose that this would be true in other countries as well. For instance, what happened in Egypt, and also I would say that you try to characterize, talk about al-Qaeda's appeal. We should not, I think, confuse al-Qaeda's appeal with mass support for al-Qaeda, because we saw in Egypt, we saw in Tunisia that people have a craving for being included into the mainstream politics, and that's what they have been agitating. And this is what probably exposed al-Qaeda's limitations as an ideological movement which has an appeal, but it is restricted to only a certain segment of the society.
Paul Rogers, just jump in there if you will.
Yes, I think the really interesting point here is that you have a potential for a transformation which in a real way is sidelining this particular movement. But I think one also has to remember that the al-Qaeda type of outlook, the ideology, is always reactive. It is reacting to something else. It is reacting to a perception of being under threat. And the problem is that if that threat, so to speak, seems to diminish, or if there are other ways which are available to wider society to counter what are perceived as threats, then again the al-Qaeda movement itself becomes frankly less significant. But you still have to remember that if in any sense we move into a period where the progress that is being made in many countries is turned back, and there's some possibility of that, then it's under those circumstances that ideas rather than movements such as al-Qaeda could come back to the fore really quite rapidly. In that sense, I think we are really in quite uncertain times.
Mahan Abedin, I want to touch on another subject here, the issue of the relationship between al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I mean, how important was that relationship between al-Qaeda and the Taliban, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan? And how will that relationship now be affected, given that bin Laden is dead? And we'll throw that question to Imtiaz Gul in a second. But Mahan, if you can just briefly answer that question, just very briefly for me.
Well, historically, there was always a strand within the Taliban that was willing to give al-Qaeda ample space to operate in Afghanistan. But at present, I think the killing of bin Laden does present an opportunity in the Afghan theater of conflict, in as much as the more nationalist elements within the Taliban can now properly and officially decouple their movement from the Taliban. Now, the links between the two were never really organizational or administrative. It was mostly ideological and symbolic. But nevertheless, if they can get rid of that symbolism and totally and irrevocably decouple the Taliban movement from al-Qaeda, then that presents an opportunity for the Americans to allow the Taliban, or at least elements within the Taliban, to participate in a peace process in Afghanistan with a view to facilitating the eventual withdrawal of American, British and other Western forces from Afghanistan. So in that sense, it is an opportunity.
All right.
I think
sorry, Paul, just hang on 1 second. I want to just get... sorry, I just want to get Imtiaz Gul's response to that. Imtiaz, are we overestimating the importance of the relationship between al-Qaeda and the Taliban? I mean, how's the relationship viewed in Pakistan? Just very quickly.
Yeah, I think you basically have to look at the history. 20th November 1999, UN Security Council resolution basically delivered Afghanistan and Taliban into the hands of al-Qaeda, because through that resolution, the world imposed sanctions, the first set of sanctions on the Taliban. And since then, the bond between the Taliban as the hosts and the al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden and others, as people who had the money, became even stronger. And this relationship continued until 9/11 happened. And since then, I think this has been just an operational relationship rather than a real ideological relationship, because Taliban are focused more on their own country rather than on the global jihad, whereas al-Qaeda radiates a global jihadist ideology.
Paul Rogers, a quick assessment of you, from you about the Taliban then.
Well, the real point here is Barack Obama wanted to try and engineer a substantial withdrawal of US troops by the time of the next presidential election, his re-election campaign. One of the drawbacks of doing this was pressure from the right wing in the United States because of the al-Qaeda connection. that is at least figuratively broken by bin Laden's death. And this is the one big issue. It may enable Barack Obama to proceed with a more rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan and to prepare to negotiate some sort of settlement involving some Taliban involvement in post-war governance in Afghanistan. That may turn out to be the run short-term real significance of what's happened in the last 48 hours.
OK, gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Thanks to all my guests. Imtiaz Gul in Islamabad, Paul Rogers in Leeds and Mahan Abedin in London. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and your suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team here, goodbye for now.